was the first Blackmoor game really like? And when was it actually held? Was it more of a miniatures war game, or was it more role playing, or was it both? I'm going to talk about my experiences playing in a recreation of this game at DaveCon just a couple weeks ago with one of the people who was actually there at the time when this game debuted, Bill Hoyt, today on Daddy Rolled a One. This video is sponsored by me. I've written a supplement for old school fantasy adventure games, specifically for old school essentials, which means it's compatible automatically with 1981 Molde BX or with Menser Basic, but also it works with really any fantasy class and level system. It's about expert and specialist type characters, and it's done a lot of research on it, and I've been working on it for a very long time, but the book is now finished. The layout's done, the cover's done, the art's done, everything's ready to go. So I'm going to be kickstarting it on June 3rd and would like to ask for your support of the channel if you could sign up for the to be notified of when it goes live on my Kickstarter pre-launch page. And that way you can learn more about what's in this particular supplement. Thanks so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. In the 1960s, there was a group of wargamers in the Minneapolis, Twin Cities area called the Midwest Military Simulation Association, or the MMSA. And this group included people like Dave Wesley, Dave Arneson, and Dave McGarry. Also, some people not named Dave, like Dwayne Jenkins, Mike Carr, and Bill Hoyt. And at the time, they were being very revolutionary about the way that they were approaching war games in order to be able to stretch what those games could do to be compatible with really what they wanted to do, how they wanted to play these styles of games. And the repercussions of those changes that they made completely changed the hobby, and it still affects us to this day, more than 50 years later. Now, at the same time, there were contemporary groups of the MMSA, kind of, here and there, a lot of times concentrated in the Midwest. One of these groups, a smaller group, was in the Lake Geneva area of Wisconsin, and one of its members was a man by the name of Gary Gygax. And it was really, they were looking for, these other groups were looking for ways to adapt changes that they'd seen and be inspired by what they were seeing these other groups doing. Now, the MMSA in Minneapolis was the largest wargaming club outside of a military or a war college at the time. And so, as I talked about in my video on Braunstein, they were kind of like a think tank, these guys, that they were coming up with these ideas that, again, were changing the way that these games were played. And when you get the intersection of those players from the MMSA with the group of players in Lake Geneva, and specifically Gary Gygax and his compatriots, the confluence of that meeting and of that exchange of ideas is really what ends up being responsible for us having the game of Dungeons and Dragons. So you don't get Dungeons and Dragons without Dave Wesley and Braunstein, and you don't get Blackmoor without Dave Wesley and Braunstein. Okay, but you don't get Dungeons and Dragons without Dave Arneson and Blackmoor. So all three of those are really crucial. And you don't really get D&D necessarily without having Gary Gygax having the wherewithal to type up the notes. And he was very big on wanting to codify everything. And, some people might complain about that, but the reason that we have the game was because he actually was interested in distributing it to a wider area. So there was a quote that I heard when I was at DaveCon at the end of April 2024, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but somebody said it's something to the effect of you don't have, without Dave Arneson, you don't have the creativity of the ideas that end up becoming Dungeons and Dragons. But without Gary Gygax, that game would probably only have been known by about 100 people. So that's the importance of all of these people. And I don't think you can pull any one of them out of this equation and still end up with the game of Dungeons and Dragons. But these ideas don't just pop up. Like there's, we want to have this very specific, easy to read timeline where this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and bam, you have Dungeons and Dragons, and you have this clear lineage of how it got there. And unfortunately, this is the real world, and it just doesn't work that way. So these ideas are fluid, as are some of the dates. So that brings me to my video on Braunstein that I just published right before this one. So I played in an original Braunstein game, like a recreation of what the original Braunstein game was by the guy who created that style of game, which is Dave Wesley. Just watch the video. You can learn more about that. But in that video, I mentioned that Braunstein was first run or created, however you want to say it, in 1969. And I got that date from a couple of places. One that's the date I've seen mentioned in secondary tertiary sources that's written down either online or in book form. But I also got it from talking to Dave Wesley himself after the game. I chatted with him a little bit about these things, and he mentioned 1969 as being when he ran that game. However, it's come to light that actually that first Braunstein game was run late in 1968. So the date that I've been told is November 18th. I did see another quote somewhere else where Dave Wesley said that he ran it during the holidays, like around Christmas time. November 18th is close enough to that. So I think that November 18th date is probably about as best as we're going to get. So it's late 1968. It doesn't change the tenor of anything else I said in that video about Braunstein, but I am trying to be, when I can, a little bit more specific about the dates and make corrections when they come up. Now, the other thing I mentioned in that video was that Strategos N was sort of developed in 1968. And again, that was because of the sources that I had read used that date. However, once again, I've been told by folks who were there at the time in the Minneapolis gaming group, and also by Kevin McCall, who is a gentleman who, he's involved with The Secrets of Blackmoor, the documentary. So he runs, I believe, the website for that. And also, I think he handles the social media, or at least he helps if he's not doing it 100% himself for that account. But he was friends with Dave Arneson before Dave Arneson passed away. So he had a lot of time to interview, and he's just got a ton of knowledge about this. And so he has told me that Strategos N was actually being played as early as 1965. So again, it doesn't really change anything about what I said about the game. It just means that these dates were slightly earlier than what I had said, but still, late 60s, I think, if you just want to use a generic term. Okay, so now part of the problem with these dates is that, there wasn't a lot of documentation at the time. When these people were creating these rules and playing these games, they were specifically playing games. I don't think there was any thought at the time that they were doing something that was going to be played by millions of people around the world 50 years later, and that somebody might want to know the exact date and time and location of when a specific rule was developed. So because of that, it's very difficult to then get these specific dates, because then you're relying on memory. Now, sometimes there is documentation. It's not all come to light. I know that there's more out there that will eventually be uncovered at some point. But for right now, a lot of the dates that we're getting is coming from interviewing people and relying on memory. And you're talking about events that occurred more than 50 years ago. And, if you asked me what I was doing on a specific date, even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you what it was. I might have a general idea, but I couldn't pick a specific date. And also, and it's no fault of anybody's, things change over time in our minds, just the way the human brain works. So if we repeat a story so many times and we get some details wrong at a certain point, our brain tricks us into thinking that the details we got wrong, are actually correct now. It's just human nature. So that's not to say anybody's intentionally misleading anybody. It's just to say that it is very difficult to pinpoint these dates down. Okay, but we're talking about Braunstein. So talking about dates, then, there's a date. If you watch The Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, the very introduction of that documentary, there's a video clip of Dave Arneson, and he's got an audience. So he might have been teaching in class, because I know he taught classes about role-playing game design, but he might have also been at a convention. I'm not really clear where he was for this particular clip, but he had an audience. Okay. And the clip it's very direct. It's Dave Arneson just being very gruff. And he says, role-playing games were created in 1971. Don't ask me how I know that, because I'm the guy who did it. And he's just kind of like, that's it. That's the end of the story. We're not going to talk about it anymore. So when he's talking about this 1971 date, is, I think, related to this article that he writes. It's almost like a classified ad in a newsletter that he was publishing as part of this Minneapolis and Twin Cities gaming group. It was called Corner of the Tabletop. And he writes this little snippet here where he says he's looking for players to play in a medieval Bronstein type game. Okay. And so now this is 1970. So it's a little before what he said in 71. But you can already see that he's running games that are going to sort of transition into being Blackmoor. And it's not a clear cut and dried, when does it stop being Bronstein? When does it start being Blackmoor? There's no, I don't think, true answer to that. So it's interesting that he says 1971, because these styles of games that have the role-playing aspect to them, they have a referee, they have players playing individual characters, or roles, if you will, and the players are allowed to take whatever actions they want. There is no limits, as long as the referee determines the chance of success, usually with dice, right? So those are all hallmarks of what we would call a role-playing game. And those games were being played prior to 1971. And Dave Arneson was a huge part of that. So I don't know if he, when he made that quote, if he forgot that he'd started earlier, or maybe he just had the dates off in his head, or it's very possible that he has a specific date in his mind of when he ran the first traditional fantasy Blackmoor game. And maybe that was in 1971, at least in his notes. But really, from what I've seen and talking with the folks who were there at the time, chatting with Dave McGarry and chatting with Mike Carr and Dave Wesley and Bill Hoyt at DaveCon, it was before 1971. And they're all important people in this. Okay, so what's interesting is if you look at this quote here at the corner of the tabletop where he says he's running a medieval Bronstein type game. So there's a lot of things that we can take out of this particular quote to kind of talk about what was happening in the gaming world at the time. So the first one being, he says it's a medieval Bronstein type game, and he doesn't explain what that means. And the implication then is that everyone reading this newsletter would understand what he meant when he said it was a medieval Bronstein style game. Now, again, if you saw my video on playing in the Bronstein game, you know that Bronstein was the name of the setting. It was a fictional town that Dave Wesley created in Prussia, close to the border of France. And so it was the name of the setting, but that became the name over time of a style of game where the setting was really, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it was setting neutral. You could do anything with that kind of game. So we know that the one I played in is now commonly referred to as Bronstein 1. We know that there's a Bronstein 2 and 3, and those ones were not successful. We don't know a lot, at least as far as I know. I know there's information out there, but it's not been published yet. Kevin McCall mentioned he's been trying to get Dave Wesley to show him his notes on this. So I'm not really clear what the setting was for those two games, if it was still in the fictional town of Bronstein. But the reason that 2 and 3 weren't successful is because Dave Wesley put limitations on what the characters could do. He gave them a list of like prescribed actions and said, you can do this, 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 or this kind of thing, because he wanted to be prepared. Dave Wesley wanted to be prepared for what the players were going to do so that he could make sure that when, character A did this to character B, that he knew that was a possibility. He had a way to handle that. And the players hated it. They didn't like that because what they liked about the first Bronstein game is that they could do whatever they wanted. So then Dave Wesley gets to Bronstein 4. And this is the one that takes place in a fictional banana republic in South America. And the setting, the timeline is contemporary with the 1960s. It takes place, it's like a Cold War thing. So that is happening in Braunstein 4. And so it ceased to be about the setting, and it's more about the style of games and having these role-playing aspects. We also know that Dwayne Jenkins is taking this idea and he adapts it to a Wild West setting in a game called Brownstone, which coincidentally is also the first ongoing campaign in this style, where you could show up to subsequent sessions and be playing the same role, and what happened was impacted by what had happened in the previous games of Brownstone. But that is a Braunstein type game. It's just changed the setting. So that's what Dave Arneson is doing here. He's running Braunstein, but he's running it in a medieval setting. And then we can tell it's also a fictional setting because he does talk about some fantasy elements. Well, what's interesting is that Dave Arneson has run Braunstein style games before this, before he mentions it in Corner of the Tabletop, that were, I guess, still fictional, but they were still bound in real world and medieval, style without, my point is without fantasy elements. So why is the first time that we see Dave Arneson talking about running these medieval Braunstein style games in 1970 in this issue of Corner of the Tabletop, when we know that he was running them beforehand? Well, there's a few reasons that have been bandied about. And again, I was talking to the folks who were there at DaveCon that had played with Dave Arneson. And so what was going on at this time was that Dave Wesley had, started to run the original Braunstein games. And then he gets called away, as he says it. The United States government gave him a job offer that he couldn't refuse. So remember, this is during the Vietnam War. So he leaves, and Dave Arneson takes over running these Braunstein games because he just had a knack for it. He was really good. He was younger than the players, but he had just an ability to kind of run these games that people seem to really enjoy. So, however, that being said, part of what starts happening with Dave Arneson while he's running these games, from what I've understood, is that he started running what we would call an NPC. So he was playing again what you'd call a dungeon master, a DM NPC in the game, and so he was starting to affect the outcomes of the games whilst trying to be this neutral arbiter and referee. And I guess some of the older players in the game didn't like that. What I also understand that they didn't like is that Dave starts to kind of get away from the historical games and Napoleonic battle recreations that they had originally done. And he starts moving into the more fictional aspect, where you might be playing out kind of an historical battle, but Dave allows the players to affect the outcome of the game, to change what actually happened. And I guess that there were some players that just didn't like that. They didn't like that they wouldn't know who was going to win, because historically one side had won versus the other. Like, maybe the Prussians beat the French, but in the way that Dave Arneson was running the games, the French could win. And I guess for whatever reason, these guys didn't like that. So a few of these players leave. And so then Dave is recruiting new players, and he gets some younger players in who don't have the context of how these games were played before. And so it's not a big of a problem. But what was suggested to me is that one of the reasons that Dave might have waited so long to start advertising according to the tabletop that he was running these games was maybe he was a little gun shy because of how he was treated by these older players that didn't like the way that he was running the games, because he wasn't running them the way that they had been run in the past. Now, again, this is all hearsay of me repeating something that was, that someone else said. So I might have gotten a few of the details in that incorrect. And if I did, drop a comment, but that's been suggested to me. But what I do know is that Dave, again, was running medieval style Braunstein games prior to this note in Corner of the Tabletop. And that's why it's important, and why I keep harping on it, because it's an important development as we look at the timeline of how we get from Napoleonic war games to Dungeons and Dragons, and all these different steps in between, and all these different people that are involved. And, some of these things have just, I think people knew about them, but they're just not widely publicized. Okay. So then we have to deal with, not only do we have fluid dates, we have fluid meanings of the word first. So I saw that, like Ben Milton on Questing Beast showed a game about Blackmoor that he played at Gary Con, run by Bob Meyer, who was, again, one of the original players from the Minneapolis group that was there at the time. And his game that he ran is what I thought in my head a traditional Blackmoor game was like. And that was sort of bandied about as being like the first Blackmoor game. The game I played in was also called the first game, but it was called the first campaign, or the first battle, I should say, by the Castle Crusade Society, which was a group that was kind of developed in conjunction between Bill Hoyt, who was there at the time, and Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. I think there were some other people involved. And my understanding from what I've seen, it leaned a little heavier into the Lake Geneva group than the Minneapolis group. But this is a first game, and it takes place in a fictional setting that is essentially like going to become Blackmoor. And one of the reasons I say that is because the model that was used for the original Castle Blackmoor was in this game that I played in. And I'll just talk about it now. And here's some photos of it. You can see the reason that this was there is the way Bill Hoyt told it. Now, Bill ran this game for us, and he was one of the players in this original game. Okay, so and he was the one who was in charge of defending this Castle Blackmoor, or fort. At the time they called it a fort, and I think it was called William's Fort, but because his name's William. And but what he said was that Dave Arneson brought all these like little terrain pieces around this castle and some of these different buildings here. So if you look at the table, anytime you see like a little plastic looking building like this one right here, that's one of the original pieces that Dave Arneson put on the table to play in this game with Bill and Gary and some other folks. Okay, Gary Gygax, that is. And at the end of the game, Bill Hoyt asked Dave Arneson, like, hey, don't you want these things back? Like, you want these or whatever? And Dave Arneson essentially said, no, it's fine. You just keep them here, because I guess they were playing at Bill's house. And again, memories get faded because I've seen different places suggested as to where this game took place. But the way Bill described it at this event was that Dave Arneson let him keep these pieces because you just don't want to carry them home, or for whatever the case is. And Bill still has them 50 plus years later. So we got to play at a table with the original model for Castle Blackmoor. So I would call this I'm going to say proto. I know some people don't like that word, but kind of like an original Blackmoor game before it was called Blackmoor. Does that mean it's the first Blackmoor game? I don't really know. I don't know how to describe what the word first means in this case, because these things were, again, not necessarily being documented as being like an event that like we now want to look back on and say, this is when things changed. Because again, they were just playing games. They were figuring it out as they went along, and they were trying to have a good time. And so, I think it's difficult to understand. I've seen other people say like, no, like my first Blackmoor game was this. And that word "my" is very key. And a lot of people have gotten confused over time and think that person was talking about, quote unquote, the first Blackmoor game, but it was really talking about that person's first time playing a Blackmoor game. So again, these things just get so confusing as to have, an actual definitive meaning. So with that said, this game that I played that was run by Bill Hoyt seems like it happened in the fall of 1969. I don't have an exact month or anything like that. Now, I've seen Bill say other times that this happened at Gen Con, that they played it at Gen Con 2, and they played in Gary's basement before going to Gen Con. But then then he mentioned that they, when I played with him, he said, no, they were at his house, which is why he has all of Dave Arneson's train. So again, things get a little confusing. I'm sure someone's going to jump in and correct all this, but these are the notes that I took when I was like scribbling furiously while also trying to figure out how to play this game. So how is this game played? Like what happened? Well, he had, all these different, pieces of paper that he passed out, Bill Hoyt, that is. And so I sat next to him because that was a seat that was available. And he handed me this. And so I was the bandits. Okay. So the bandits. And so just a quick word. There's some parts in this that, might be upsetting to people, but these were the goals that were given to these particular bandit type characters. It's very much of the time. So it's, pillaging and other terms that were used to go along with that. But basically, I started with 6 horsemen. So I believe they were light horsemen. They definitely weren't heavy. So they might have been medium, but I think they were light. I had 10 bowmen, and then I had 14 swords, like 14 swordsmen. Okay. And so here's a picture of the box that he has them all in these like old cigar boxes, and the figures were in here. And as I was pulling the figures out, and you had to put the horsemen on top of the horses. And so we were talking about it, and basically these are some of the original figures. Now, Dave Arneson had some really nice figures. You can see them on the table here. But a lot of them, they were just using these kind of cheap plastic figures. And this is where these, the original game, this is how it was played. So my general instructions were to loot and to fight. And then you see here some other activities of unsavory nature. Okay. And then it says, my first objective was to get lots of loot. Money is obtained in the form of loot. Gain as much loot as possible. So pretty clear what I'm supposed to be doing, right? I'm bandits. Now, there were a bunch of other armies, I guess you'd call them, in this particular game. There were the defenders of the fort. There were invaders. There were 2 different groups of mercenaries. There were Vikings. There were 2 different groups of peasants. And then there were 2 different groups of rescue forces. I think I got them all. I think. I'm pretty sure that's it. I might have forgotten 1 or 2 off the top of my head. But in any event, everybody's playing. So this is what really stood out to me, was that I wasn't I was playing the role of the bandit leader, but I didn't have a name, and it really was irrelevant. I didn't have a personality. I was basically playing a war game. That's how this game was run. And so he handed these sheets out, and then he told everybody of their different troop types, how far they could move. So horsemen can, of course, move farther than footmen, but then heavy footmen can't move as far as scouts and light footmen and things like that, right? And then he would tell you where you started out. So my particular guys, I had 6 horsemen who started out at this little house, or I think it was an inn. I guess it was an inn that was on the same side of the river as Castle Blackmoor, or Williams Fort, whatever you want to call it, as the model of Castle Blackmoor. So that's where my bandit leader was one of the 6 horsemen. Okay. The entire rest of my forces, the 10 bowmen and the 14 swordsmen, were in the forest all the way on the other side of the table, on the other side of the river. There's one bridge that you can use to cross the river, and you are not allowed to cross the river. You couldn't find a narrow space to cross. Now I know from having watched videos and having watched The Secrets of Blackmoor, I could have maybe tried to knock down a farmhouse and take the wood and put a bridge across the river. That didn't occur in our game because I never really got close enough to be able to do that. So he gave everybody, and everybody had a sheet like this that told them what their objectives were. We didn't share our objectives with anybody. You could kind of guess based on what role they were playing. And he told you where to start your figures. You had your movement there. He had tape measures. So we're literally measuring out how far figures are going to move on each turn. And not all the players started at the same time. So some of the players, I think the Vikings, didn't come into turn 8. And one of the rescue forces didn't come in until turn 9. So my people were there at the very beginning on turn 1. But, so he passed these out, and then he basically just said, okay, go ahead and start. And I think everyone was sort of confused, start what? How do we start? What do we do? Who goes first? I think we're so used to that structure, and these games just were not like that. So, there was a lot of kind of hemming and hawing, and people were just sort of milling about trying to figure out what was going on. A lot of side conversations started, some of which didn't have anything to do with the game. One of the players was really confused because he hadn't played in an unstructured game like this. And even for me, I thought like there should be a little structure. Like I just wasn't sure what was going on. And we were just sitting there, but then I knew that my goal was to loot. And so all of a sudden I just said, okay, I'm going to move my horsemen away from the inn. I'm going to go to this farm that's undefended. There's nobody over there. I'm going to ride over here and I'm going to loot the farm. What happens? And he's like, oh, okay. Like, that's awesome. You went over there and there's nobody there. It's easy to loot and you get 10 loot, basically like 10 gold or whatever you want to call it. And that was points. So I got 10 points. So I realized that doing that was a little bit impulsive, but I just kind of wanted to start and see what was going to happen. And so I just did it. And me doing that actually turns out that's kind of what kicked off the game, because then everyone started reacting to like what I was doing. And so one of the things that I had discovered was that there were two different groups of peasants, and one of them was sort of a, let's call it like a kill the rich type of peasant group. And that player happened to kind of just be sitting next to me. And he was starting, his players or his peasants were supposed to start out in the same inn where my horsemen were. And I said like, hey, let's talk about like maybe teaming up. Like you have an army of peasants. Why don't you help me attack some of these farms and loot them, and I'll split the loot with you, because I wanted to get loot. And I also wanted to have some backup because I only had 6 horsemen on this side of the river. Now, my other bandits that were in the forest, I kind of left them there for the time being because, my bandit leader was on this side, so he wasn't able to give them direction. Now, I think Bill would have let me move them anyway, but I was kind of doing a little bit of role playing that I'm going to explain in a second about why I thought that it made sense for my bandits in the forest not to move. The other thing that happened was because they were in the forest, Bill basically said nobody could see them. And so I thought I had a little bit of protection there. So I was trying to talk to this peasant player, and I think he was just confused and maybe didn't quite hear me, or because it was very loud. It was very chaotic. One of the things about DaveCon is the rooms where these games are happening. It's like any big convention you've been to. There's multiple games going on at the same time. The way it's done here is that there were basically 2 or maybe 3 games happening at the same time, but in a very small space. So a lot of times it was very difficult to hear whatever, in whatever game you were playing. But I was never able to get an alliance with this peasant player, which is too bad because I think it could have helped both of us. The other thing that I figured out was like, there's this group of mercenaries, and I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to go loot really quickly. I'm going to loot some houses. I'm going to get money, and then I'm going to hire these mercenaries to help me because that's what they're there for. And I wanted more protection. I felt like I've got lightly armored guys, and I'm spread on 2 different sides of the river, and I'm going to leave myself open to enemy fire if I try to cross the river. And so I was trying to figure this out. Well, it turns out that the mercenary players don't join until later. Now, the player who was playing them was just sitting like right next to me. So I started talking. I was like, oh, technically we can't talk right now. And so we stopped. And that's at that point, that's sort of where my alliance buildings sort of stopped, because what happened was for the rest of the game, I ended up being on the run from the player who was controlling the defensive forces at the fort, at the castle. So as soon as he saw that I was attacking this farm, so only attacked that first one, he rode out in force to come get me. And I was like, okay, I need to get out of here. And so I started to go on the run. But in this particular game, very much like early D&D, once you're engaged in combat, in melee combat, you can't really disengage unless there's particular circumstances. There were die rolls involved, and I tried to get away a few times and it didn't work. So I thought, like, I'm on horseback, I should be able to outrun him, but that didn't work. So like on turn 2, I think I lost 2 of my horsemen to like some heavily armored knights on horseback and a bunch of like individual, like, footman knights. And so that wasn't working out. And so again, I was like, okay, I'm in trouble because my goal is to loot, but all I'm doing is being defensive. I'm trying to run or I'm being attacked and I'm losing guys. And as soon as I started to move my guys out of the forest, the other guys that were left in the castle and the tower, they had range from where they were on the wall. And so they started shooting at me. And I was like, okay, I need the protection of the forest. And so the castle player tried to talk me into making an alliance and said, okay, look, you stop attacking my farms, and why don't we join together? Like, I will knight you. I will make you official, and you help me to repel these invaders that I know are coming. So he already knew that there's invaders on the way. And so he's like, if you have your forces join with me, I'll make you legitimate. You just have to stop robbing and attacking, my farmland. And I was kind of like, well, my goal is to loot and I get money. And so I said, well, like, will you pay me? Like, because if you pay me, okay, then we can stop fighting and then I can at least get money that will contribute to my winning condition, I thought maybe. And he said yes, but then he was being very, very, he's like, all right, first you need to get back the loot that you've already taken. And you need to lay down your arms and all these things. And I was like, that's pretty unreasonable. And so as it turns out, so I didn't want to give the loot back because I thought that would mean I'd have to subtract those points from my goal. But I found out after the game, no, it didn't matter. Like, I still got the points. Now, had I known that, it might have changed how I reacted to this guy. I might have given him the money knowing that I got to keep the points and made an alliance with him, because he was merciless. He was very, like, as a player, he was totally cool and we had a nice time. But like, as like running his forces, he basically put the entire focus of his army on me until I was so whittled down that it didn't matter anymore. And so, like, I guess long story long, which I'm famous for telling, none of my 6 horsemen made it across the river. He killed all 6 of them. So, or I should say he killed 5 of them. And then one of them was killed by, the other group of peasants. So I've told you there was 2 group of peasants. One that was like the kill the rich. There was another one that was very much about like wanting to protect their, obviously their farmland and things like that. But they were also wanting to protect, there was a monastery and they wanted to protect the treasures that were in the monastery from anybody that might want to try to come and loot it, which could include me, but also like the Vikings and the invaders stuff. So this guy went to the monastery and like kind of nobody was over there. So he was kind of over there and I didn't really see what he was doing, but it turned out every turn he was just saying, I'm going to take treasure from the monastery. And he wasn't taking it for himself. He was taking it to protect it. He was trying to keep it so that if anybody went to the monastery and tried to loot it, there wouldn't be anything there, which is really smart, I think, or at least it made sense at the time. I just didn't see him doing that. I did try to get him to come on my side to help, attack the Kingsmen or the Baronsmen, whatever you want to call them. And he was just like, no, I have no interest in helping that. And that was the last, at that time, those were the only forces that were on the table. It was the 2 different groups of peasants, my bandits and the Kingsmen. And it wasn't until multiple turns later when all these mercenaries started showing up. By the time they got there, my guys didn't ever meet up with them because, again, I was on the run from the guys in the castle. So, now what I told you a little bit about the role playing thing with my guys in the forest. So when the guy from the castle approached me and said, do you want to join? I said, let me go join up with my guys in the forest and I will ask them if they want to join you. And I thought like that was a way of doing this. And it also explained why I wasn't really walking all the way over to the other side of the table to move my guys in the forest. And he was like, no, I don't, he didn't think that was appropriate. And he wanted me, I think that's when he wanted me to lay down my arms. He's like, you can go cross the river if you put down your weapons and like one of you can go and the rest of you have to stay here. And I was like, that's not what I wanted. Obviously I wanted to get my guys as far away from him as possible on the other side of the bridge. And then I felt like, okay, then I could just pick people off with my archers on the bridge. I was never able to really execute that plan. So as I said, all of my horse guys died. My horsemen died, before getting across the river and without having looted anything else. Okay, mind you. So, then, now all these other forces started to show up, and then it was just utter chaos because you've just got people sitting on all sides of the table, each running a different army, and you had these rescue forces showing up to defend the king, but one of them ended up turning and not doing it. They pretended like they were helping, but they were really actually, I'm guessing they must have had their own goals that made it like they were turncoats essentially. And so he starts attacking the king's men and, And then there were, the invaders were coming. I don't know what group of like culture they were supposed to represent, but they came in. And then the Vikings came in and they're on the river. The invaders came in and they're burning the forest. And so that was frustrating because, again, remember, I'm using the forest as like my cover. And if I move out of the forest, I'm a sitting duck. And they started burning the forest from the other end. And I remember I kept asking every turn I had to ask Bill, like, do my guys know the forest is on fire? Can I see? And it took like 3 turns, which was good for me because it meant like I didn't have to move yet. But then when I finally saw that the forest was on fire, then things were crazy. So at the end of the day, I ended up teaming up with the invaders, with what was left of my forces. So remember, all my horsemen are gone, but I had archers and swordsmen left, and I had pretty much all of them because I hadn't moved them anywhere. I hadn't gone into combat. So I joined up with the invaders. I started using my archers to kill the Kingsmen on the bridge. And when they were pretty thinned out, I brought my swordsmen out and started attacking. And at the end of the game, I still had a lot of guys left, but the game sort of ended because all of these forces, like the peasants, ended up teaming up with the rescue forces, one of the groups, and attacking the castle. And the guy running the castle, like at that point, it was just a war of attrition. He had a lot of guys, and he'd closed the moat. He'd pulled up the drawbridge so that, over the moat, so that he had the moat protection, and he had all his guys inside, and he'd made it very clear that he could withstand a months-long siege if need be. But the game kind of like just wrapped up because he'd sort of just run out of guys. So I wouldn't say it was like a big, like huge victory moment because there was just so much chaos. But at the end, I ended up with 19 points, which I know doesn't sound like a lot. But my other 9 points came from killing enemy troops, usually with my archers. They were pretty good. But the combat was really resolved, very interestingly, very close to what we would now call the chainmail rules. So I meant to grab this earlier. I keep my chainmail in my original box, my original D&D box here. But these chainmail rules written by Gary Gygax and Jeff Parent. Now, what's interesting, and again, you talk about the timing of things and when things are published. So it turns out that this original game that took place with Gary and Bill Hoyt and Dave Arneson, they were using rules that would become chainmail. A lot of people say, Dave Arneson created Blackmoor using the chainmail rules. Well, it's not really true because they were using those rules like an early version that wasn't published yet. And then when they did publish them, it was originally published not in chainmail. It was published in this book. I got this from Kevin McCall. He sent it to me. Very nice to send me a PDF. This is either the Domesday book. I've also heard people say Doomsday book. And I specifically asked people at the convention, how do you pronounce that? Because people have tried to correct me before. And I got both pronunciations. So I'm going to call it the Domesday book because that's what Kevin called it. But in any event, there's an early version of what becomes chainmail in the Domesday book, but without the fantasy supplement. That's the key element here. So, and that's the kind of game that we were playing. There were no fantasy elements in this game at all. Okay, but there was a lot of rolling of dice when you interacted with people. It was usually a 2d6 roll with no modifiers. And it was sort of like, well, you have 5 guys, so you're going to roll 2d6 5 times and see how many hits you get. And was it 2d6? Now I'm questioning myself. It might have been a D6. You know what it was? It was you were rolling D6s, but you were rolling 1 for each troop type. So that's another key element in this game. Unlike other war games where a figure represents a unit of troops, in this version of the game, they were playing each figure represented an individual person. So these people that you see I have here, 6 and 10 and 14, that was my total. I had 30 guys, not 30 figures representing 300 guys, as an example. So, but they would roll, and like my archers, depending on the distance, if I was at close range, I could hit on a 4, 5, or 6. But if I was at longer range, it was either a 5 or 6 or a 6. That was kind of how the game was run. And you got as many dice as you had figures put into the fight. And then depending on, what the other person rolled, then you would remove the figures. That's how combat worked. It was very quick. And, again, there were no modifiers other than range if, for a ranged attack. but for melee attack, there were really no modifiers. So that was kind of like how this game wrapped up. I thought it was, very interesting to share that. And as I said, I was a little surprised about how this game ran based on, I guess, my preconceptions of what I thought a Blackmoor game was going to be. Now, was this a Blackmoor game? Was it the first Blackmoor game, or was it a Bronstein game? I think the answer to all those questions is yes, kind of. Again, I think that these terms are fluid, and I don't think that there's a definitive way to describe what this game was. I do think it's really interesting to compare it to the Bronstein game that I did play in the night before. And again, I made that video about that recently. But in those two games, Bronstein, which predates the game I played, but not by much. Okay, but Dave Arneson was clearly running a Bronstein style game, so we know Bronstein came first. So that game had no miniature figures. The first Blackmoor, or the medieval Bronstein game that took place in a world that might end up being like Blackmoor, it's a very clunky way of saying that, had miniature figures. The Bronstein game did not have armies. It had individual roles. The Blackmoor game had individual roles running armies. The Bronstein game had no turns, but the Blackmoor game definitely had turns. Bill Hoyt, was keeping track on like a spreadsheet almost, handwritten, but like on each turn. And he was very specific, like, okay, movement first. And he would pick an individual and say, okay, you can move, bandits, you're up. You can move. Invaders, you're up. You can move. And you moved first, and then you did combat. And then that turn was over. Everyone did their moves first. Then everyone negotiated any combat. Then there was any ranged things that happened. And then you went to the next turn. Okay. So it was very procedural. The Bronstein game was not like that at all. There were no turns. Okay. So those are the things that are different. Now, what was the same about those two games? Well, they both had a referee there to adjudicate and make rulings based on what the players want to do. So I know that there were definitely things that came up in the Bronstein game that Dave Wesley had to figure out how to handle that. Now he's been running these games, or, at least he knows the game well enough that I don't know that we surprised him with anything that we did. He did say that the ending of that game is the first time that had ever happened, but it was just a combat. And I know that he's had to figure out those rules before. In fact, on the very, very first time that he ran that game. So there's that. But in the game that we played with Bill Hoyt, he didn't get involved with us making alliances and negotiating with each other and things like that. So his rulings were mostly like double checking that people had the range correct and helping run the combat, telling us what to do, because there were no written rules for this game. We didn't have that. So he would tell us how to handle the combat situations and who got to roll what dice. Now, there were other times where, as an example, when I said, does my character see that the forest is on fire? Well, meanwhile, the guy who asked to set the forest on fire, his invaders, the first thing he did, he got off the boat and he set the forest on fire. So Bill Hoyt was coming up with rolling dice and telling the guy, roll this number of dice. And then based on what the guy got, Bill would tell him, essentially, did the fire get going yet? Are there flames? Can you see the smoke? So he was making up those rules. Now, I don't know if there's, fire rules in the game. I got the impression that no. So Bill Hoyt was kind of making that up as he went along. So that's the role of the referee. Now, both games had role playing. Bronstein, definitely more so, but there was role playing in the Blackmoor game because, again, we're playing these commanders of these different armies, but we were staying within character, so to speak, when making alliances with stuff. So especially the guy who ran the castle, he really got into it and talking with authority and being very clear that he was there to protect all these peasants and all that stuff. And even when I told him that I knew I was trying to make a deal because I wanted to get away and keep some of my guys. And so I told him that I knew some of the peasants weren't actually on his side. And he basically said, I haven't seen them do anything that would indicate otherwise. And they're under my protection. Like, they live on my land. So I'm here to protect them. And so again, role playing based on the actions that your character would take. And I'd call that role playing. Okay. So, there was that. There were goals. So in Bronstein, our characters had goals. My character had goals, student G. And then in this game, my character had goals. Okay, my bandit leader, what were the bandits trying to do? So what I'm trying to accomplish. So that was similar between both. And then in both games, neither one of them had magic. Okay, now I know obviously magic's going to be added to Blackmoor later. I don't think a traditional Bronstein game that at least is called Bronstein and not called something else, I don't think those have magic. But in any event, it was interesting to me because, again, I thought I was going to be playing in a style of Blackmoor game closer to the one that Dave Arneson described in Corner of the Tabletop, where he talked about like the troll under the bridge and things like that. And that's not what it was. So again, it's this kind of like, in between area that I think maybe people just aren't as much aware of. And I definitely wasn't. And you guys know, I do look into this stuff. I've studied as much as I can. So that is kind of going to wrap it up for this video. Now, I am going to have another video coming out soon where I talk about some other things that I learned while I was at DaveCon from talking with these people. I know I keep talking about DaveCon, but it was an important thing for me to meet these people in the hobby. And I think you guys will be interested to learn some things that are going to come out of my discussions with these guys, or just from hearing them talk. And it's things like where hit points come from, armor class. Why was there descending armor class? Saving throws. The first thief player. So I have a whole video on the thief character class and how it was developed for Dungeons and Dragons. It was developed for the game D&D after the D&D rules had been written, developed by the folks out at Aero Hobbies in Santa Monica, California. So I have a video about that. However, there were thief players in Blackmoor prior to that. And so I talked to the person who played that character. I also talked to the person who played the first cleric. And there was something really interesting that happened in that discussion that I did not know. I also talked, that same person also is responsible for why we have experience points in leveling in role-playing games. So if you want to know where all those things come from, I'm going to have a video that basically just discusses all of those. It's going to kind of just be a collection of these concepts and mechanics that we, I say take for granted, but yeah, I mean, hit points are so ubiquitous. I think pretty much almost every role-playing game has some kind of version of that, some way to keep your character alive so that you don't die with just one hit. Okay. So I'm going to have a video about that coming up. So make sure to come back and check that out. And the best way that you can make sure you don't miss that is by subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell icon to be notified when I post new videos. If you could also please comment and let me know how you liked this video and if you learned anything, and if there's any specific topics you can think of that maybe I skipped over that I might have gotten information on while I was there. There was so much. I tried to take as many notes as I could, but let me know and I will put in the comments below. I also have some access to some of these players where I can email them and ask them questions. So, don't barrage me with a bunch of those, but I can, I don't want to take advantage of their good nature and their time, but I can, once in a while, I think, chat with these people and ask them some questions. So let me know. Also, while you're below leaving a comment, you'll see in the show notes a place where you can find some notes from Bill Hoyt, who published for free his old campaign notebook from the first time that he bought original Dungeons and Dragons, and he has his notebook of like what his games were like, full of maps and key locations and things like that. And it's all handwritten, and it is a real treasure of the time. And so there's a PDF of that. You can see that here, but I'll put a link to where you can download that. He wants it to be as widely distributed as possible, from what I understand, to make sure people can see it. So you'll definitely want to check that out. And you can also find places while you're down there to join me on social media, and like Facebook and Instagram, Twitter or X, and things like that. So that is going to wrap up my video today, I'd also like to mention that I have added the supers thanks thing. So if you like this video, once again, I don't have a Patreon, although I will tell you it is coming soon. But for right now, if you want to give me a little extra encouragement and help me out, you can leave a supers thanks. I guess that's what you call it or something like that. So, and if you do, I mean, super appreciate that. I'm sorry for the pun, but I really do appreciate all of your support. And that's going to wrap this up. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Please help support More Daddy Roll to One by buying a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other items from my shop. Thank you. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I worked on my notes for this video. So today is Monday, May 6th. However, I started working on these notes. Well, I worked on them on the plane on the way back from Minneapolis, which was on April 29th. But I've spent a lot of time working on over this weekend. And of course, May the 4th is Star Wars Day. And on May 3rd, Friday night, my daughter's school had a fundraiser event. And for the past 3 years, I have offered to donate basically the bar. So, other people bring like beer and wine and stuff like that. But I create a signature cocktail for that event. And, I bartend. So, I try to pre-batch it as much as I can. I don't have full equipment there, but I made this drink for the folks. And so this is called a paper plane. Now, the event on May 3rd was Star Wars themed. So it was originally supposed to be on May 4th, and they had to move it because of when the location was available. But they'd gotten folks there from the 501st to come dress up. And so I decided to do a Star Wars theme. So I did a small tweak to the paper plane, and I called it the Corellian Freighter, which I thought was really funny. I think one woman the entire night knew what a Corellian Freighter was. A lot of people couldn't read the writing. They thought it said Corellian Fighter. It was really funny. So in any event, a paper plane is a new style cocktail, or it's kind of what they call a new classic, and it's in equal parts. So there is a classic pre-prohibition cocktail known as a Last Word. And that is a combination of gin and lime juice and maraschino liqueur and green chartreuse. And it's all equal parts. So usually you do 3/4 of an ounce of each. So you get a 3-ounce drink. And so because it's equal parts, it's super easy. It's very difficult to screw up unless you try to eyeball and you don't measure. Okay. So the paper plane is a riff on a Last Word, but it swaps every single ingredient. But what you're doing is you're using that equal parts recipe and what those equal parts represent, the base spirit, the citrus, the sweetness, and then herbalness from the green chartreuse. And in this particular case, it swaps all of those. So a paper plane is bourbon instead of gin, lemon juice instead of lime, and then Amaro Nonino and Aperol. And those are going to replace the maraschino liqueur and the green chartreuse. So both Amaro Nonino and Aperol are in the Amaro category, but one of them is more of the aperitivo. It's the red orange style Amaro, sweet, bittersweet orange flavors for the Aperol. And then the Amaro Nonino falls into the digestivo category. It's a brown Amaro, and it has a little bit more like, I want to say caramely. That's not really the right word, but it's a completely different flavor profile. And those two together are representing what is replacing the aggressive herbal nature of the green chartreuse and then the super sweet flavor of the maraschino, because both Aperol and Nonino are bittersweet. So they're doing double duty. In any event, it's equal parts. So I really like it. It's very refreshing. If you like bourbon, I highly recommend you try it. If you don't like bourbon, I especially recommend you try it. There was a woman at the event. She's like, I don't drink bourbon. It's too alcoholic. I don't like it. And I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do, because I'd pre-batch it. I'm going to make this for you. And if you don't drink it, I'm just going to set it aside and I'll drink it at the end of the night when I'm done. I don't drink while I'm bartending because I want to stay sober. So I told her that I would do that. And she really liked it. She said she wouldn't necessarily go out of her way to make it, but she drank the whole thing. And she was afraid that it was going to taste like bourbon, which I guess is a flavor she just doesn't really like. But she said she found it very well balanced, which is the point of this drink. So cheers, and thanks to all of you who stayed this far through the video. I always love getting comments from people who stay through the bonus content. Okay. Oh, that's so good. Okay, so as far as what I was listening to, again, because it was, May the 4th, and then some people say Revenge of the 5th, or today could be Revenge of the 6th, however you want to say it. I know I told you I was going to stop with the jazz albums. One more for the time being. Okay, so promise next time I'll do something else. But this is just such a fun album. Empire Jazz. So as you see this, got Chewbacca on keys, you've got C-3PO on bass, got a stormtrooper on sax, and then R2-D2 on drums, and then Darth Vader's in the audience having a beverage, a little cocktail there. Maybe he's having a paper plane. No, the paper plane wasn't invented when this album came out. But it says, featuring an all-star jazz ensemble, produced and arranged by Ron Carter. Now, Ron Carter, very famous jazz bass player. He played with Miles Davis in Miles' second great quintet, which also included Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams on drums, and Wayne Shorter on sax. So he was part of that group. Ron is still with us. He's in his 80s. And I follow him on Facebook. I don't play the bass, but it's so much fun because he's on there every day giving people tips and advice on like being, how to play bass. And like during COVID, like he was doing online bass lessons where you could join him virtually and get tips. And I really like him. He seems like a really cool guy. He has a pretty prolific catalog, and I also like jazz bass. So anyway, now some other names that are on here. There's some very famous names on here. As you see, it says it's an all-star jazz ensemble, but I'm just going to point out one name, Bob James. If you're like me and you grew up in the 70s, you know Bob James because you probably heard the Taxi theme song playing. The title of that song is Angela, but it was a theme song for the TV sitcom Taxi back in the 70s. It's probably going to be stuck in your head now for the rest of the day. Bob James is the guy who wrote that song. Okay, so you know who he is. So anyway, what this album is, it's jazz renditions of songs from The Empire Strikes Back. This comes out in 1980, the same year that Empire Strikes Back is released. And basically, it's just adapting those songs for a kind of, jazz feel. And it's great. And what I love about it is it takes some of the more obscure songs like Lando's Palace or The Asteroid Field, which I really like both of those cues from the original soundtrack, but they're not full-blown songs. They're musical cues for a specific piece of action that usually lasts like less than a minute or so. And he blows them out into full themes and explores around them, which I really like. And so it's not just listening to like elevator music versions of Empire Strikes Back. These are like really well done tunes. It's very difficult to find. It's not on Spotify. Again, you could probably find all or most of it on YouTube, but just search for it if you can. If you ever see it in a discount record bin, snap it up. You don't want to miss this. So anyway, that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed that. And again, if you stayed this far, let me know what kind of records you'd like to see if it's not jazz. All right. Cheers and thanks again.